Imagine scattering little marble-sized balls of cellulose embedded with iron and manganese in the ocean that would gobble up all our emissions. It's not that simple, obviously, and there are many, many stages in between, but they'd basically grow phytoplankton, which would eat carbon dioxide on the surface. When they die, they would sink into the deep ocean and take the carbon with them for decades, centuries, or longer. Well, there is a company that wants to do that, and it wants to do it in New Zealand waters.
What we are doing here is not just important to us, it's important to all of the world. We are developing a technology to solve climate change.
The company, Gigablue, is even being backed by former climate change minister and Green Party co-leader James Shaw. But there's always a but. Experts are cautious and they want proof it will work without disastrous side effects.
We just know so little about what the potential implications of them are environmentally, the risks of which they are quite significant. We don't know whether they are even able to mitigate climate change.
Much of the research done hasn't been made public, and the government is holding back on giving the company the green light for more extensive testing.
There are a number of scientific red flags throughout the documents.
I don't think we are at the stage where we are confident that these will work, and that is why there is real concerns about deploying them without the appropriate kind of scientific background.
I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, RNZ climate change correspondent Kate Newton boils this complex science down to the basics for us. Kate.
Hello.
Nobody understands this stuff. I want you to explain it to me in words of one syllable. What is marine carbon storage?
Okay, so marine carbon dioxide removal is a type of marine geoengineering. And essentially the idea is to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is what is causing climate change because of all of this carbon dioxide that we're putting into the air, take it and then somehow store it in the ocean. And there's lots of different ways you can do it, and there's lots of different ways you can store it, but the intent is the same.
Yeah, so basically we're looking for places on planet Earth to hide the bad stuff we're doing. And we've centred on, if you can't bury it, put it deep under the Pacific Ocean.
Yes. And I guess it works in the same way, essentially, that, we grow forests deliberately to take carbon dioxide out of the air. That's, green carbon storage or land-based carbon storage. What we're talking about is blue carbon storage or ocean-based, or it can happen in rivers and harbours as well. There's lots of different places you can put it.
Okay. We don't really know a lot of the mysteries of the ocean.
No.
So what are we thinking about the success of this and what it will do to the ocean?
So there's lots of different issues, and you can sort of boil them down to two different categories. The first is, does it actually work? The second is, how do we prove it? There is a third category as well, which is, what are the other effects that it might be having on the ocean of doing all of this? And so depending on what type of marine carbon dioxide removal you're talking about, those problems manifest in different ways. And what Gigablue is trying to do is a type of marine carbon dioxide removal that they call microalgae carbon fixation and sinking. What experts in both marine law and marine science I have talked to have said is that what that technology appears to be is very similar to a type of carbon dioxide removal called ocean fertilisation, which has been very controversial.
Okay, so because the product of sinking this carbon dioxide in the ocean leaves problems behind.
Yeah, so there's problems both in terms of the potential environmental effects of ocean fertilisation, and noting here that the company does draw distinctions. So bearing that in mind, and we can talk about the distinctions that they draw later, but if we're just focusing on ocean fertilisation for a moment, there There are issues around, and we can talk about what ocean fertilisation is. That's probably the first thing we should be doing here. So ocean fertilisation, you can do it in a number of different ways. There are kind of two main types. One involves growing seaweed and the other involves growing phytoplankton. So phytoplankton are tiny little organisms that grow in the surface ocean, and they need two things to grow. They need nutrients and they need light. They're a little bit like trees in that sense. They need light to do photosynthesis. And through photosynthesis, just like trees, they absorb carbon dioxide from the surface ocean. Then, when they die, lots of them get eaten, like at the bottom of the food chain, right? So lots of them will get eaten by bigger types of plankton. Zooplankton might get eaten by fish. They might get eaten by all sorts of things. And so that carbon, therefore, is recycled very quickly back into the surface ocean. But a small proportion of these little phytoplankton or microalgae sink to the deep ocean. And then, because currents in the deep ocean, where it's very cold, can take a very long time to move around and shift to other parts of the ocean, the theory is that the carbon that sinks down that far will stay there for decades, centuries, or even longer. So that's the basic premise. And then the premise of ocean fertilisation is that if you can somehow cause more phytoplankton to grow than there otherwise would have been, you'll get more carbon sinking to the bottom of the sea and therefore more carbon being sequestered for those very long time periods. So that's it, sort of in a nutshell.
Is this technology, proven? Are there environmental question marks?
TBC and TBC.
Okay.
So
the whole thing's a work in progress, right? Because
the whole thing is work in progress. Yeah. It's what people that I spoke to described this as nascent, being in its infancy. There's lots of research happening, which has really kicked off in the last 10 years. And there are universities, research institutes, but also startups in this space looking at all of these things and trying to answer what somebody told me are essentially basic science questions about this. And they involve things like, can you show that you're growing more microalgae or more phytoplankton than you otherwise would have using this technique? When they die, do they sink? How deep do they sink? Do they stay there? Do they get eaten on their way down? How do you then kind of follow them through the ocean and find out what those currents are doing, where the currents are going, how long it is actually taking for this carbon that theoretically is stored deep down to resurface? So there's lots of different variables where things could go wrong. In theory, it works. But a lot of this is based on modelling in particular, because we don't know a lot about what happens deep down in the ocean.
Well, we don't. And, I guess there have been so many cautionary tales in the history of Earth and science that we need to start doing the homework before we do this. Before we bury the nuclear waste, we need to work out if it's leaching in 20 years down the track, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there are cautionary tales around similar types of technology already. Just in 2024, there was a company based out of, I think originally the States, but they ended up doing a lot of their activity off the coast of Iceland, called Running Tide. And this company was essentially trying to do a similar thing but using seaweed. So the idea was that they would encourage more seaweed to grow, and then they would sink the seaweed down deep, and that would stay there and sequester the carbon.
Running Tide is an ocean-based climate solutions company. We're trying to use kelp, which is like a natural way to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and sink it to the deep ocean. Trees are fantastic, but land-based solutions for carbon removal run into some sort of spatial constraints. We don't have those in the ocean, really. So it's a fantastic place to pursue climate solutions.
They had investment from blue chip companies. Microsoft invested in them. And then a few years down the track, they essentially were struggling, as I understand it, to be able to prove and to verify this particular mechanism. So they veered off and went with a different approach, which was sinking a whole bunch of wood chips deep into the ocean where they would stay and sequester carbon. And that also didn't work. They ended up with lots of these wood chips washing up on the shores. And I might add as well that by the time this happened, the company had gone bust and did not actually pay for the cleanup that happened.
Gosh. Okay, so this all brings us back to this Israeli company that wants to come and practice all this practice their techniques down here. So who are Gigablue and why are they here?
So Gigablue was founded a few years ago, I believe 2022. They were set up for Israeli entrepreneurs. Some of them with an interest and a background in marine science, others with a background in entrepreneurship, set this company up. And relatively early on, they became interested in New Zealand. They've been operating in New Zealand for a couple of years now, 2 or 3 years. They have actually completed a couple of very early ocean trials here that were allowed to go ahead by the Environmental Protection Authority. And
so what's the attraction about New Zealand?
Well, the attraction about New Zealand is that New Zealand has a huge exclusive economic zone, which encompasses deep, cold ocean. And the important thing that I didn't say in my explanation of how this works is that to actually get more phytoplankton to grow, you need to do it in places where they're not growing already. And some of those places are areas in the Southern Ocean where you have, for some reason, very low levels of iron in the water, which is one of the nutrients that they need to grow. So the theory is that if you can supply them with this extra iron, there's already the other nutrients that they need, you'll suddenly get phytoplankton blooms where they previously wouldn't have occurred. And there are some other issues with that.
Those other issues include possible nutrient robbing,
where you're putting in iron in one part of the ocean, but then what might happen is that phytoplankton in that area are using a whole bunch of the other nutrients already in the ocean, because they don't just need iron, they need iron and a few other things to grow. They're using nutrients there that otherwise might have gone downstream with a current to an area of the ocean that is iron rich, where a phytoplankton bloom would have occurred, but because you've already used those other nutrients upstream, that bloom doesn't happen. So it becomes like a zero-sum game.
Your interference is upsetting the balance.
Yeah, so you've got to prove that that's not happening. But that's essentially the theory. And so New Zealand was attractive to them because of its access to those parts of the ocean where, in theory, this technology will work the best.
Okay, so for these little mini experiments, the Environmental Protection Agency said, yes, go ahead. But now they want to move it up a bit, right?
Yeah, so they did a couple of very early experiments, and they were also at the same time doing a set of laboratory experiments. They got the Cawthron Institute in Nelson to do a couple of limited studies around some of the environmental effects of this as well. But they were going out to test these particles that and this is part of their difference that they draw between their approach and ocean fertilisation. Ocean fertilisation, as it's sort of previously been known, is you put a whole bunch of nutrients in the sea and then you hope that the phytoplankton like them and grow. Gigablue is saying its approach differs because it's created these particles that are essentially little habitats. They are embedded with these nutrients. The phytoplankton will grow on there. It's more contained. The fact that it's in a particle means that there's a greater likelihood of it sinking to depth before these phytoplankton.
Okay. So what do they look like?
Little get recycled.
Brown balls or something? Or?
Yeah, kind of little round balls. From the descriptions in these documents, they're kind of between 0.5 centimetre to 1 centimetre in size.
Okay, they're quite little, like marbles.
Yeah, quite little, like marbles. One of the officials in these documents kind of referred to them as having a quote-unquote Ferrero Rocher structure, where they're little balls with a sort of almost like a scruffy kind of coating on them on the outside. They're made of cellulose.
Which is not nuts and chocolate.
No, not that delicious, I don't think, unless you're phytoplankton.
Okay. Right. Okay. What is Gigablue? How are they going to step up their program and are we going to be allowing that?
Yeah, so they had done these couple of little experiments which just involved a couple of tons of particles going into the ocean. In one case, they didn't even have the nutrients in them. The first one, the idea was just to sort of test how they sank and drifted, because obviously that's part of what they need to be able to show. Then they wanted to step up the size of these trials and of what they were doing. And two things happened. First of all, they went to the Ministry for the Environment to say, hey, we're finding it really hard because the regulatory system at the moment doesn't really recognise this as something that's happening in the ocean that is distinct to, say, marine dumping. You know, we're trying to do this for a good purpose, and so we want essentially a new category of what they call a permitted activity, which is something that can happen in the sea without it needing to go through a full consenting process
So once
each
again,
time.
technology is ahead of the law, basically.
Essentially. And other people have drawn the distinction. It's not like a perfect distinction, but between this and AI, in sense that the regulators and science
hadn't
is
been
still
thought
kind
of
of
at the time.
trying to keep up. And the other thing that they were doing simultaneously was going to the Environmental Protection Authority to ask for permission to do a much, much larger research trial. So it's important to say that the reason they can do this at all is that there is already a permitted activity in New Zealand for genuine marine scientific research. And so that was what they were applying for, this permitted activity permission to do. It's not a full consent. It's just like, hey, this is what we want to do. Do you agree it's a permitted activity? And the EPA can say yes or no, and then it goes ahead or not. This time they wanted to put 1,000 tonnes of particles, which is like much, much larger than anything they had wanted to do before. It's actually quite a big amount.
Whenever I hear gigaton, I'd be very careful. I think it needs to be shown like 1 ton, 1,000 tons, 10,000 tons. And if you show 1 million tons is reasonably feasible, then maybe you can start talking about a gigaton.
That bigger trial was turned down by the EPA last year. They concluded essentially that it amounted to marine dumping, which you can't do under New Zealand's domestic law and also under the international protocols that New Zealand is a member of. And they were also concerned about the environmental effects. There was an environmental impact assessment summary that was sent to them. They had a look at it. They felt that it wasn't sufficient, that it may have underestimated some of the environmental impacts. They were worried about seabirds. And they were also not convinced that it amounted to marine scientific research. And I can't read into what they meant by that, whether they thought that it was, in fact, verging into a commercial practice or something else. But those were sort of the three main reasons that they turned it down.
Now, to do all this work, GigaBlue needs money. The money could come from selling carbon credits if this method is verified as something that actually works and can be quantified. But how do you measure how much carbon's being sucked out of the air over an ocean? And where's the proof? Because remember, a lot of the research isn't publicly available. And here's another sticking point, because from the truckload of documents Kate asked for, she found out about behind-the-scenes arguments over whether this does really work, with officials casting doubt on it, and scientists not convinced there's enough evidence on the risks before there's expansion. This is James Carey, a senior marine scientist and researcher at James Cook University in Australia.
Many scientists like me would argue that early-stage research of this kind is more appropriately developed through controlled, smaller-scale lab or tank-based studies before moving towards any kind of ocean deployment or sale of carbon credits. Such activities would not require such large amounts of investment, and there are anyway other resources that could be accessed, such as philanthropic grants or collaboration with universities, rather than pre-selling hundreds of thousands of credits.
And this is University of Tasmania marine scientist Leonard Bach.
We have to rely a lot on models and very little on empirical measurements. We can actually verify that anything happened. We may sometimes find qualitative evidence that something happened, but to have a comprehensive budget of how much, based on which any sort of carbon credit could be sold, will be very hard.
They haven't sold any carbon credits yet, but they have entered into an agreement a couple of years ago to verify and provide 200,000 carbon credits to an aviation services company called Skies 50, which I think at the time it was signed was the largest ever offtake agreement for a blue carbon company.
Well, that obviously displayed quite a bit of faith in this method.
Yeah, and I mean, they do have a lot of faith in their method. When I spoke to one of the co-founders, Sapir Marcus-Elford, she was adamant that this is, a safe, it's a proven and effective technology that they've created here. But what they want to do are these ocean trials to build up the evidence base to show everyone that it is all of those things.
We are really eager to create those evidence-based results, to be in the ocean, and to prove to anyone that it really wants to be also part of this research that our activity is safe as we show it is. We actually came to New Zealand because of its strict environmental approach. We really believe that this is the way to go, and every new development should comply with strict environmental guidelines.
And that, I guess, is where GigaBlue differs with a lot of other people with knowledge of this technology or of this approach. Essentially, it boils down to a company that has a huge amount of faith in what it's doing, believes that it is acting for the good of the planet.
Yes.
It has very noble intentions, versus a whole bunch of people who are saying, hang on, we actually don't know how any of these technologies really work and if we can verify them, and maybe we need to slow down here.
But can we afford to slow down when the problem is urgent? New Zealand's not the only place where such experiments are going on.
From the shores of eastern Canada to the beaches of North Carolina to New Zealand's open sea, companies are exploring a new frontier to fight global warming.
We've got too much carbon dioxide in the air, and the logical storage place for some of that excess carbon is going to be the biggest reservoir by far that exists, and that reservoir is the ocean.
If this works, and because of the size of our EZ, presumably more people would come down and do the same thing.
Yeah, and I guess that's sort of the value proposition that's been made, and that, the likes of James Shaw, who has been doing some advising for GigaBlue on the site and was involved in some of the meetings with officials, has said is that, if New Zealand can be a leader here, because of our positioning, like our geographical positioning, this could actually be really good. It could create jobs. It could, put us in a position where we are, leading the way with this technology, and able to capitalise on that, both for, economic benefit, but also just for the benefit of the planet itself.
Well, it doesn't hurt to have a former leader of a Green Party on your side.
No. And I should note as well, I did ask the ministry if they felt there was additional pressure placed on them by the fact that they had their most recent minister now acting on behalf of this company, and they said no.
Because there's this real tug of war, isn't there, between the urgency of taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, reducing our emissions or nullifying them, and going into a whole new world where, like as we were saying before, there's so much we don't know.
I think that's the thing, and I think that was the argument that James Shaw was making. He was saying, this is such an urgent crisis that we're facing in terms of climate change that, we need to be trying everything. This isn't a silver bullet solution. It's one tool in a toolbox. But if you don't do the scientific research and don't allow that scientific research program to continue and to conclude, then we'll never know if it could have worked.
Meanwhile, scientists say that while we're trying to find new ways of burying carbon, the danger is that it's a distraction from what the world should really be focusing on, and that's cutting the emissions we produce in the first place. That's it for today. The Details, a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by William Saunders. Thanks to Kate Newton, whose extensive reporting on this can be found on rnz.co.nz. I'm Alexia Russell. Mā te wā.